Welcome to the Libertarian Institute YouTube and Odyssey channel. I am joined by our news editor, Kyle Anzalone. Kyle, what's happening, brother?
Keith, thanks so much for inviting me back to do this again.
Of course, and Patrick McFarland, who is the Justin Raimondo Fellow. Patrick, do you have a favorite Justin Raimondo article or general contribution?
Yeah, I'm reading Reclaiming the American Right, and I think that's really important for what we're doing because there's a long storied history of Republican anti-war conservatism, and I think bearing that torch is worth fighting for.
Excellent. Our first story, major NATO war games set to begin miles from Russian base. Kyle, what is this about?
So the U.S. and NATO are kicking off a couple rounds of war games right now. This first war game is called Hedgehog, and it's going to involve 15,000 troops from 10 countries, including 4 non-NATO member states, including Sweden and Finland, who recently applied for NATO membership, also Ukraine and Georgia. And so these are a pretty provocative round of war games just from who's attending alone. But to make it even worse, that these war games are being held in Estonia, just 40 miles from a Russian military base that is along the border. So it's about, 40 miles from the Russian border. But, these are happening very close to a Russian base. I think these war games are a little bit more led by the UK than the US. I think they have about 8,000 troops in Estonia for these war games. They're going to simulate repelling a Russian invasion of Estonia. And they say that these were planned prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there's been more interest, but didn't go on to elaborate, who's maybe now attending these war games that weren't previously slated to. It's unclear in particular what the Ukrainian forces will be doing, if this is maybe a covert way to get some training on American or NATO equipment for for Ukrainian soldiers, so they could go take that and use it to kill Russians in Ukraine. It is possible, and so I worry that these war games are provocative. However, more disturbing is the war games Neptune Shield 22 that are being carried out in the Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Baltic seas, and the U.S. and the USS aircraft carrier. Which one is this? The USS Truman is under the command of NATO. Strike for NATO is the command designation. And for the next couple of weeks through June 3rd, the U.S. and several warships in the Mediterranean Sea are under command of NATO and not the U.S. So kind of crazy that we allow our ships to be placed under the command of NATO, especially when it's not even a wartime, right? I mean, there's war, but NATO isn't supposed to be at war with Russia. And so what's actually the excuse for giving up the command of our ships? We had a few months ago the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, saying that the USS Truman was in the Mediterranean and that it could be ordered by the president or another allied leader to carry out strikes to defend territory against Russia. And so, there is a lot of ways where the American military is really the military of the global empire. And, this is a lot of where the America First arguments originate from, that, the U.S. is essentially subsidizing the defense of Europe with everything that it's deploying and doing. These are two articles that myself and Will Porter wrote for the Institute this week, trying to cover everything that's going on. I'll just add two. Dave DeCamp had an article this week at antiwar.com that the U.S. is also beefing up its military capability and running military drills in Alaska in order to be on Russia's other flank. So lots of war gaming going on right now.
Kyle, do you have any information on what's going on between Turkey and Iraq?
Turkey and Iraq. So, I mean, for several years now, Turkey has occupied northern Iraq, at least since 2017. I think the initial excuse was repelling the Islamic State with all like the power vacuums and instability then. And there was even a time where the Turkish president Recep Erdogan was talking about conquering some territory that was previously, Turkish, the Ottoman Empire, stretching all the way to Mosul, Iraq. Now, the U.S. rallied the Kurdish forces and allied with the Iraqi or the Iranian sponsored militaries in Iraq to ultimately take back Mosul. However, north of Mosul in Iraq is a lot of mountainous area. It's sparsely populated by Yazidis and Kurds, and there are Syrian and Turkish Kurds of the YPG and the PKK who do hang out in this area. And so for years, Turkey has carried out bombing raids and things like that. The Iraqi government has protested, but Turkey's a NATO member state. And so if the U.S. isn't going to tell Turkey to knock it off and make Turkey knock it off, then the Iraqi government just can't do it. And so Turkey has occupied Iraq. They've had, I think, about 500 troops. And recently, the rhetoric around that has picked up. I'm not exactly 100% sure why. I think Turkey announced like a new round of military operations and carried out a bombing campaign. But, it was just an escalation in a conflict that nobody cared about before. And, I'm not sure why it picked up so much media attention. A lot of Turkey's complaints, and I think why they're doing this in Iraq too, is because they can. They're really upset about what the U.S. is doing in Syria by arming the Syrian Kurds. They say that the Syrian Kurds are no different than the Turkish Kurds, and Turkey has been fighting an insurgency against the PKK, but generally against Turkey's Kurdish minority for years. The Kurds are treated extremely poorly. Their political parties are routinely rounded up and thrown in jail. The 2016 coup, Erdogan used that to go after the Kurds and throw a lot of them in jail when I don't even think there's any evidence that the Kurds were involved. He blames a guy named Fatah Gulen, who actually lives in Pennsylvania. So, but the Kurds drew the brunt of that. They build a lot of dams in the Kurdish territory. And so, this is an area of the world where there's like civilization that stretches back thousands and thousands of years. And some of these villages have been flooded by the Turkish dams. And I think in part, the placement of the dams isn't just about energy or depriving Syria of fresh water, but also about displacing legacy Kurdish communities as a way to destabilize the population and have more Turkish supremacy throughout the state. But they can't really bomb in Syria because that's airspace controlled either by Russia in Syria or the Americans. But in northern Iraq, the Iraqi military doesn't have the ability to do that. And the Americans don't really control the Iraqi airspace anymore. I mean, the Iraqi Air Force is an American Air Force, but the Americans aren't patrolling the skies like they do in Syria. So I think that's kind of why Iraq.
Next article, the Global Pandemic Treaty, what you need to know. Patrick, fill us in.
Yeah, I think this really dovetails off of our first topic that Kyle presented there, because really essentially what you have is American policy being dictated by obligations to other countries. And when it comes to the Global Pandemic Treaty, it's really a huge red alert threat right now, because to go back in time, the big narrative around COVID-19 is, and there was a Forbes piece out talking about exactly what the major narrative is. And the narrative is presented by Forbes, says, that 1996 movie Independence Day, where much of the world united to defeat a common enemy? Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic that started in 2020, pretty much the opposite happened. The world was about as organized as all cat produced and directed. That's weird. As an all cat produced and directed episode of Dancing with the Stars, or rather Dancing with the Stars, who are also cats. I detest this article by Forbes, but I chose it because it's like the mouthpiece of this condescending Nina Yankowicz style, like, I don't know, global transhumanist kind of technocratic agenda. But essentially what's happening is that there was the IHR, which was basically kind of a global pandemic treaty that was passed in 2005. And that is that was the protocol by which the UN handled. They called them, I think, like pandemics of global concern. And when there was a pandemic of global concern that was declared, it kicked in a whole bunch of these treaty obligations for all of the UN member states. And what they want to do in the narrative that they're trying to use to pass this is to say, oh, well, obviously the IHR rules didn't work because they failed to prevent COVID, as if anything prevented COVID, or if that's even possible to prevent COVID, something like that. So what we really need is a more strong-throated version of the IHR, and then enter this global pandemic treaty that they're talking about. And they would like to institute this, and in fact, they've begun discussions about what this is going to look like, and they really would like to advance this agenda. So I think it's incredibly dangerous and scary, because essentially what you could have is the ushering in of a new world order, in a sense, where the UN dictates to all the member nations exactly what they have to do in terms of their how they respond to a global pandemic. And this, of course, they kind of couch this in terms of inclusivity and not leaving anyone behind. But James Corbett just had an episode where he talks about this, and that was the first screen that you threw up there, Keith. But he's talking about, he went through all of the first comments on the new treaty, where everyone came to the table and said, oh, this is what we need to keep in mind while we're doing this. And all of it fostered around inclusivity. And no one questioned, well, why exactly do we need a new pandemic treaty? And so one of the big things that they're talking about is making all of these terms obligatory and mandatory, and coming up with an enforcement arm that would force all the member nations to institute a reaction to a new health emergency of global concern. And I think it's terrifying, frankly, and I think a lot of people need to keep their eye on it and oppose it with everything that they can. I was on with Tommy Salmons the other day, an interview that just dropped that I really, really enjoyed, but we were talking about this conception of decentralized tyranny. And that is basically where all the states have to adhere to, all the countries in the world have to adhere to a global agenda, but the enforcement of that totalitarian system is decentralized to whatever country, plantation that you're currently living on. And I think it's pretty scary.
Yeah, I was watching an old video with Klaus Schwab, and he was basically asked, well, why did you start the World Economic Forum? And the explanation was more or less, we're sort of bringing a place where both business and government can come to exchange ideas, number one, and two, to take some issues and elevate them to the height of public consciousness. So that's what can be focused on a global scale. So these organizations like the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum or the Council on Foreign Relations, it's not that they're the real lawmakers, or they're, infiltrating necessarily and, making threats against people who are actually calling the shots. It is my understanding that their entire existence is justified to get people talking about a thing, to move public opinion in a certain direction. Here's where we're going with X. What's going to work is this. What we've learned from history is that, and this is sort of their justification for existence. I think that's much more realistic than they're really calling the shots but behind the scenes. Is that more or less what you see with the World Health Organization? Because it's not like they necessarily make laws which affect us, but it seems like they control the narrative, which we end up having to abide by.
Well, they do, but again, they're seeking to make these the contract terms, the treaty terms, mandatory, and they're talking about the enforcement mechanisms of those. So in the sense, I think, like, Rothbard talks about how the nations of the world exist in a state of anarchy, and there's no overarching system that obligates these countries and forces them to do things. But what they're really talking about is making all of these mandatory and enforced somehow. And when I'm talking about these terms, Here's a long list, a list of thematic wishes. So there are forces within, and I'm reading from an article I didn't send you, Keith, but there's a long list of wishes that people within the WHO would like to see. A One Health approach for pandemic prevention and early detection. Stronger health systems information and reporting mechanisms, including a better use of digital technology for data collection and sharing. A reform of the WHO alarm mechanism, the public health emergency of international control, declaration process, and travel restrictions. Pathogen and genomic data sharing. Resilience to and response to pandemics, including universal access to medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, medical equipment, and treatments, as well as resilient supply chains, technology transfer. So, stronger international health framework with a strengthened WHO at the center and increased global coordination. Reinforcing legal obligations and norms of global health security and standard settings of healthcare systems. So, in a way, I think it literally is moving more towards, a global legislative body.
Unbelievable stuff. Next we have Kyle Lanzalone. Israeli police attack mourners. Oh Jesus, I saw this video. It's one of those that's so bad that I'm like, am I really seeing what I think I'm seeing? Kyle, fill us in on this issue, please.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Keith. This was one where you gotta watch like several videos from several different angles, and it actually wasn't until I read the Israeli police statement that I decided to write the article, just because you imagine that there's actually going to be more, but it doesn't really seem like there was in this case. So last week, Keith, we talked about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was a journalist covering a raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. When she was shot, several journalists, Palestinian journalists, identified Israelis as shooters. Israel, the government, the prime minister put out a video claiming it was Palestinians, but geolocation on that video quickly disproved that it could have been those Palestinians that possibly killed Shireen. And so, it's pretty clear that the Israelis killed her, and as she was wearing a vest marked press, internationally recognized, as well as a helmet, she was shot in the face. She did, I think they did an autopsy. They got the bullet. It was a round that was used by Israeli forces, and then they planned on burying her on Friday. Now, she is a Palestinian American Christian, and so she was going there. They're going to do a service at the church, but then I think more in Palestinian tradition, they were going to walk her body through the streets in the funeral procession. And so initially, even this, I didn't even capture in my article because I didn't know at the time. But prior to her body even leaving the hospital, the Israeli police tried to carry out a raid to prevent the funeral procession from happening at all. And you could see in video riot-clad police officers entering the St. Louis French hospital in Sheikh Jarrah, East Jerusalem. And then now the more famous video, though, is after her casket leaves, there is a very large group of Palestinians and then a very large group of Israeli police officers in full riot gear. And the Palestinians have flags. They're carrying a casket. It looks like there's some words exchanged. And then it looks like there's a couple Palestinians that throw water bottles at the Israeli police, and then the line of police charge at the Palestinians and immediately start swinging their clubs at people, but not necessarily at people who threw the water bottles, but deliberately hitting the people who were holding the casket several times in the legs and in the torso area. Some of the videos have very close-up shots where, I mean, you could see they land like 4 or 5 blows on one guy who's a pallbearer, right? And so even if you could find some excuse for the Israeli police having to apprehend people who threw a water bottle at the police officers during a funeral procession, the fact that they attacked the actual people holding the casket is absolutely disgusting and inexcusable. But then later on, as her funeral moved forward, her body was in a hearse. And so I haven't been able to actually figure out if it was definitely the car her body was in, but a car that was a part of the funeral procession. And this was like a parade. Not, it's a procession, but there's people on both sides of the street as her body's going through, and there's Palestinian flags hanging out of the car, and the Israeli police come and they rip down the flags, and then they also rip down the flags of a church that her parents were in on Friday morning. And so it's just like this level of absolute cruelty. Now, apparently the Biden administration is a little upset about this, according to Mitchell Piltnick, writing at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Americans got assurances from the Israelis that this kind of stuff would not happen at the funeral, and it did. I'm not surprised by it at all. It's not that uncommon for Israelis to mess with Palestinian funerals. And then, of course, this one where the tensions are so high, not only, Shireen was, considered like a trailblazer role model journalist. She's a female journalist in the West Bank. She's been covering it for Al Jazeera for 25 years. So, she's a veteran face. Everybody knows her. And, her death was huge. And right after her death, the Israeli police went to her house, where you could say people are having a celebration of her life. They were playing music, they have flags, and they demanded the music be turned down and the flags be taken down. So, this harassment has been building. And of course, it comes as I think so far in 2022, 34 Palestinians and 18 Israelis have been killed in violence between the two groups. And so this is we're getting to the point where something really bad could happen. Fortunately, I guess, I was really thinking that with the assault on the legacy of Shireen at her funeral, that there could be some larger skirmishes that develop maybe between Gaza and Israel, but that hasn't happened.
Yeah, and this is the sort of corner that people put themselves in when they try and pick sides like Israel or Hamas or America or Iran. You end up having to justify the most evil, ridiculous nonsense. I mean, gosh, I shouldn't speak before I look, but I would love to see what Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager have to say on this issue. I'm almost afraid to look because I know it's going to be defending them. But if you watch, have you guys ever seen Cartnarks on YouTube? Basically, it's this guy who goes around shopping centers all across America. And if someone doesn't put their cart back, he doesn't harass them. He asks them very kindly. And more or less, they flip out at him, at least on the videos that he chooses to upload. But all the time, people will get really intimidating, start walking towards him, and people will either throw water bottles or something non-threatening, but being aggressive. Now, think of how a cop who has a taser and a baton and a gun, when they get a water bottle thrown at them, oh, it's the greatest atrocity known to mankind, almost as bad as January 6th. But anyone else is still trying to de-escalate, even though they're not public servants, so to speak, even though they haven't gone through all this training. The average officer in both Israel and America, it appears, has less attempts to lower the stakes in the situation than anyone else does. They're constantly trying to increase tensions, almost like just as a justification to make an arrest. And this was just so vile. But look, if you don't have, some principle of self-ownership or voluntarism, if you're just Team Israel because of any historical claims that you or your ancestors have, then you're always going to end up defending this terrible nonsense. So sad.
Right. And can you imagine just the idea of showing up to a funeral in riot gear? I mean, it's like that alone is almost unbelievable to do, right? Like how you could possibly not feel like you're the stormtrooper in Star Wars when you show up to riot gear at a funeral. But I guess just the way the culture is and how kind of militant it is, it's not that surprising.
I did want to show up to Donald Rumsfeld's funeral in riot gear, but so maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. The next article we have is on Bush's Freudian confession. Who had this one?
Yeah, that was mine. So I do enjoy Caitlin Johnstone's articles because she's particularly spunky about things, and she put this up. This is maybe the George W. Bush gaffe of all George W. Bush gaffes, because it really contained a kernel of truth. And so she says, during a speech in Dallas at Southern Methodist University's George W. Bush Presidential Center on Wednesday, the man himself, George W. Bush, did the best thing ever. And I'm pretty sure it's the single best thing that has ever happened. I do not believe I'm exaggerating when I say that. So basically what he does is he's talking about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, saying that it's the worst thing ever.
You know what? I'm sorry. Let me
Play it.
I think I'm able to.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia, and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75. Here's the
Jesus Christ.
Incredible. So I don't know if the listeners noticed, and it bears repeating even at the end. He says, well, Iraq too.
I know. What did that, what was that in reference to? I thought he was, or no, I missed.
No,
Wait,
so
I mean,
this is the most amazing thing ever, right? Because here he is calling Vladimir Putin Hitler, and then he has a Freudian slip and says Ukraine. But then even in his, maybe he's a little drunk because he sounds like he's got a little Pelosi going on to me. But then he says, well, Iraq too. And so
I know.
He acknowledges that he is doing, like, if Putin was on stage cracking jokes about how he launched a stupid war in Ukraine, these people would be outraged. And here Bush is doing it right in front of them, and they're just laughing at him. It's unbelievable. Yeah. And I think the best line from that whole Johnstone article is, there's not enough shoes to throw at him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as Scott Horton makes the case in Fool's Errand, the invasion of Afghanistan and the killing of civilians there that has occurred is just as unjustified as a place like Iraq. Okay, in Afghanistan, 0.00001% of Afghanis were behind 9/11. I mean, how many? Kyle, if you had to answer, what percentage of Afghanis in 2001 were literal associates or co-conspirators with Al-Qaeda? How many would you say?
I would say about 0, because the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, and they're actual Afghans. Al-Qaeda was mostly a collection of international terrorists, mostly Arabs, like Osama bin Laden himself. And the Taliban signaled to the U.S. several times, especially under the Clinton administration, that, they could make a move on Osama bin Laden. It's not... For, I think, political reasons within Afghanistan, we'll say, it wouldn't have been a very popular move to just have the U.S. come in and assassinate and take out Osama bin Laden on behalf of the Taliban, but the Taliban were willing to look the other way and to help facilitate that for the U.S. Mullah Omar, I believe, said before the 9/11 attacks, he called Osama bin Laden a chicken bone that, he couldn't get out of his throat. He was just like a constant problem for him. And also worth remembering that Osama was causing problems for Sudan in the earlier 1990s, and the U.S. greenlit him going to Afghanistan, where, he did have a legacy of being a part of the resistance to the Red Army, the USSR, and, the U.S. operation there. So, I mean, in so many ways, the U.S. is far more responsible, not just in causing the blowback, but just in making Osama bin Laden who he was, than the Taliban themselves, who just had to deal with him after the U.S. greenlit him being dumped on their doorstep.
Unbelievable stuff. Yeah, he always gets a pass for Afghanistan because of 9/11. People think that, well, it was inevitable. His
He
hand
had
was
to kill a
forced.
bunch of people, so like we'll feel bad about the Iraqis, but the Afghans, like somebody had to die. We were all real angry, so we're not even gonna think about that. We're just gonna assume it's justified.
So before we move on, I just have to add this because this is the biggest takeaway from John Stone's article, aside from the shoe comment, Kyle. She says, one of the many interesting things about this occurrence is the likelihood that Bush's words tumbled out the way that they did because he's either heard a lot of criticisms of his invasion or has been thinking a lot about them. A familiar neural pathway would explain why his brain chose the exact worst word he could possibly swap out for Ukraine in that moment. This would be a small light in the darkness for we ordinary folk who oppose war and love peace, because it suggests that even the worst empire managers cannot fully insulate themselves from our criticisms.
Excellent points. She really is dynamite. My first one is a movie review I did of 2000 Mules. Now, I really loved this documentary. I will admit there are quite a few propaganda methods. If you look at the music, if you look at the reenactments, sometimes you can tell they're really trying to push the viewer to believe one thing over another. What I like, though, is that his very first example of the voter fraud that he uses, let me get the exact, I want to say it was 2018. And let me see, what did I write here? D'Souza's first example is the 2018 election in North Carolina, where a Republican congressional campaign was caught engaging in such illegal activities using absentee ballots. So that was overturned. So, like everything else that is totally criminal, it's bipartisan. Also, if you remember, with all of these new voting rules, ABC reported that 50,000 voters received the wrong ballot in Ohio, of all places, almost as bad as Florida, or people living in two states that were caught voting twice in the same election. This is a guy who admits it on camera, and Project Veritas did an excellent job being in two states and confirming that there was a guy who voted twice. So that was really interesting. But my favorite quote comes from D'Souza's other movie titled Trump Card: Beating Socialism, Corruption, and the Deep State. The reason that I quote this is just because you can get a perfectly accurate vote count, but if people are voting for the most immoral stuff, or if you recognize mob rule as a legitimate form of organizing society, well, then you're just setting yourself up to be screwed in the future. So here is my favorite D'Souza quote of all time. He says, "This is capitalism's trump card. It encourages creativity and empathy and puts them at the service of the wants and needs of the people. The inequality the socialist left despises isn't created by the entrepreneur. It's created by us. The proud boast of democratic socialism is that it puts the people in charge of the economy. What control do you have over the post office or the DMV? We vote in elections every 2 or 4 years, but as consumers, we exercise our choices daily directly through the market. The free market is far more reflective of popular consent than democratic socialism. We don't have to extend democracy from the political to the economic sphere because we already have it. Capitalism, not socialism, is the true form of social justice." I thought that was great. I think D'Souza, while he is absolutely terrible on things like Iraq, for example, well, it's like looking into a mirror because I was exactly where he was some time ago. Granted, he's much older and wealthier and should be able to admit when he's wrong, and he's a Christian, so he knows the "thou shalt not murder" principle, I hope. But so he's still got a little work. The point is that, I mean, a guy comes over from India and makes it in America, and I think is totally a net benefit to freedom. I'm going to see him on Sunday at the Biltmore or the Arizona Grand Resort. So anyone who wants to hang out, I think Connor's going to be there with me. You can come and check out. I think tickets are $20. Charlie Kirk's going to be there. Great group of people to shake hands with. The TPUSA crowd is mostly people our age, so I usually love going to those events. Did either of you guys see the movie?
No, but can I send you a free Palestine shirt to wear to that?
You know what? I was wondering because our shirts just got in the mail, and I love the way they look, the Libertarian Institute shirts. So I don't know if I'm gonna wear that. Oh yes, that's one of them. I got the same exact one, and I want to interview Dinesh, so I might want to wear a tie. What a stupid thing to say on a recording. Okay, next topic, Biden reverses course on plans to ship long-range rockets to Ukraine. Really? Kyle, fill us in.
Yeah, so the Ukrainians are somehow shaking down the White House again for more weapons. Right after the U.S. passed, or I think the Senate just today passed a $40 billion $40 billion aid package, most of that being arms going to Ukraine. So we're looking at like $30 billion in weapons since the Russian invasion. But that's not enough. They want these new weapon systems, M270 rocket launching systems. They could fire 20 to 40 miles, or if they have the upgraded kits, up to 100 miles. And so that's quite significantly further than the howitzers, the M777 howitzers that we've already sent to Ukraine. I believe they limit their range at 17 miles. So Ukraine feels like, they could use these to more effectively fight against the Russians, and their demand the Americans provide them. The White House is apparently concerned that if we provide these to Ukraine, Ukraine will use them to carry out attacks inside of Russia and thus escalate tensions between Moscow and Washington, which I guess there's at least some people in the White House that are somewhat still concerned about nuclear war. So that's good. Apparently, Joe Biden was open to the idea when he was traveling to Europe and was at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, but has since, according to a congressional staffer, cooled on the idea, although somebody from the White House did say that all options, including this, are still on the table. So they are, considering it. My guess is that Biden will ultimately cave in the end, but maybe not. And we could hope that the president still has some again concerns and thoughts of the potential for escalation with Russia and doesn't want to push this too long. Now, my initial reaction to this was, of course, how ungrateful do you have to be to have gotten $53 billion in aid from the U.S. over the past 4 months or 3 months, and then you're demanding more? But at the same time, the U.S. is making sure that they never, ever have to compete with Russia. Russia never has an economy. They never get to have a sphere of influence. They never get to say what happens in Syria or Georgia or Ukraine. And they are using the lives of Ukrainians to make that happen. And so they're letting a lot of Ukrainians die, and they're providing Ukraine with a lot of weapons to do it. And so if they're demanding more advanced weapons to do that, I guess it's a little understandable then. But still, it's a lot of money going out of Washington into Kiev. Although, most of it probably comes back at least to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where the, leaders of the military industrial complex live.
Kyle, I'm going to play this recording that I got from The Observer. They said it was from 2006. Do you know if this is legit?
Have troubled me deeply. I do not think we should have pushed for an election in the Palestinian territories. I think that was a big mistake. And if we were going to push for an election, then we should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win.
Yeah, that's real.
Okay. I was going to say, because that's how I opened my D'Souza article. I got to check with you before I go ahead with these things. But I had heard that originally in 2016. And a lot of Trumpers were saying, look, Hillary's going to try and steal this election. And we have her, on audio. I just thought that was that was incredible. Because we have George Bush saying, Russian elections are totally illegitimate. We have Hillary saying, look, we're going to have to, rig this Palestinian election. And then anyone who questions the 2020 election, though, is like banned from Twitter. You can get a strike on YouTube for questioning it because it makes you a January 6th insurrectionist. It's amazing to see what little respect they have for the own system. They constantly are pushing on us. Just
And
unbelievable stuff.
And just to clarify a little bit, that's after the election. After Hamas won the election, she was saying we should have never had the election if we didn't know that Fatah was going to win in Gaza. And that's how Hamas came to power. Now, there's a really good article, and I know Scott Horton would know the name of it, and I don't, and I feel really bad. But there's a really good article on this whole thing, Keith, and I'll have to get it to you at some point because I'm sure you would enjoy reading the whole history of that quote.
Next one we have, Patrick, is this yours?
Yep.
Read this headline and fill us in.
So this is actually a Zero Hedge article. Biden's disinfo board paused as, quote, Scary Poppins resigns. So I'm sure people will be familiar with this. Nina Yankowicz was named as the chair of the Disinformation Governance Board. This is a Department of Homeland Security entity that was just announced, I believe, a few weeks ago. But I mean, I think it'd be naive to think that this hasn't been in the works for a while. But they're framing this whole thing as if the DHS board, the Disinformation Governance Board under the DHS has been paused, or somehow it's defeated or something like that, when I really don't think that that's the case. I think it'd be naive to think that this doesn't come back in some way, shape, or form. Former President George W. Bush appointees Michael Chertoff and former Clinton AG Jamie Gorelick are tasked with reviewing the Disinformation Board's mission during this pause. And it seems like, I don't know, some people are crediting a social media campaign pushback as being what exactly caused this pause. And some people are pointing to Jack Posobiec. There's this Washington Post article that is pointing towards his efforts. I'm not a big fan of Jack Posobiec, but if he had a hand in creating the unraveling of this DHS board and the firing, or resignation rather, of Nina Yankowicz, I suppose that's commendable. But I don't know, Keith or Kyle, you guys are a little more familiar with some of these Bush era figures. Is there anything you can say about Michael Chertoff? Because, Keith, you were underlining his name.
Well, that's just a name that constantly comes up when it comes to the elites looking for justifications to do things that they've always wanted to do. Most famously, after, why do we need such a huge government? Well, there's the Soviet Union. And then once the Soviet Union comes down, the new ideology is pushed by Chertoff. Look, we need a big government now more than ever, and military, because this is not like the olden days. He said this on C-SPAN. It's not like the olden days where you could see the enemy coming over the hill. We have cyber attacks. We have airplanes. We have all these methods of transportation. And that's why basically we need to have bases all over the world, and the bigger, the better. So Chertoff was just the typical person that places like C-SPAN or Fox, or according to Michael Chertoff, whenever they wanted to say something like we should have more power, they would just quote Chertoff. He was just so predictable. Kyle, do you remember this name from the Bush years? Yeah. There was Taylor Lorenz's Washington Post article where she's basically saying Posobiec's early tweets shaped the narrative, and Yankowicz was positioned as the primary target. Oh, you see, that they constantly tell us that, there's certain people in society that are born with privilege. But then when someone is head of a department by the Department of Homeland Security, well, that person doesn't have privilege. Actually, they're oppressed, if you think about it. Everything is backwards in psycho land. Republican lawmakers echoed Posobiec's framing and amplified it to their audiences. This is just so pathetic that the most powerful people on earth, well, they're really evil. Meanwhile, Taylor Lorenz says that the person who runs libs of TikTok is like terribly dangerous, and that's the person who needs harassing. People with actual institutional power, oh God, what did Douglas Murray say? He said, these people think bravery consists of going around to empty hornets' nests and kicking them as hard as possible. The second they find a real hornet, they run 50 kilometers in the opposite direction. And that is so true. The most powerful people, get a total pass. But people with no institutional power, they need to be held accountable. Goddamn Kyle Rittenhouse. That man needs to be put in jail. It doesn't matter that a guy was pointing a gun to his face 6 inches away and a psychopathic pedophile was chasing him, threatening him. No. That guy needs to be taken down. This is just unbelievable stuff. Good catch on Yankowitz. They're not going through with that. Do you think they will bring that back once they get someone else?
Oh, I'm sure, or it will morph into something else, something the same but different with a different name.
My final piece here is gosh, how do let me make sure the screen is shared. This is Hidden History, Churchill Kills 1,297 French servicemen in 1940. I want to say, gosh darn it, I thought I had the quote right here. So this is from Winston, the International Churchill Society, titled Churchill's Deadly Decision Destroying the French Fleet. This is commonly referred to as France's Pearl Harbor. Here's a section. In the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill faced a terrible dilemma. France had just surrendered, and only the English Channel stood between the National Socialists and Britain. Germany was poised to seize the entire French fleet, one of the biggest in the world. With these ships in hand, Hitler's threat to invade Britain could become a reality. Churchill had to make a choice. He could either trust the promises of the new French government that they would never hand over their ships, or he could make sure the ships never joined the German Navy by destroying them himself. The point is, looking at, well, first of all, they mention all the constraints that Churchill is facing against the National Socialists, which of course agree. The point is that when it comes to atrocities that your own heroes are engaged in, you could think of 50 reasons why, they really had to murder these innocent people and that create a French Pearl Harbor, so to speak. But when any other country does anything, well, all of a sudden the standards begin. They have extremely high standards for everyone else and virtually none for their own heroes. And this is why I think Murray and these people are wrong about someone like Churchill. The fact that they've made this guy into a total hero, once people start seeing the reality behind a lot of these situations, well, then they don't trust anything else you say. So instead of making these Lincolns or the FDRs or the Reagans out to be these like infallible human beings, we should recognize that even if the best people were given the power of the British Empire, they would use it in totally unjustified ways. So finding out that Churchill actually murdered a number of French servicemen, I want to say it was Ralph Raico that I originally found this out from in a book he wrote a long time ago, but it was just fitting because May 10th came around and that was the big day that Churchill was appointed to be prime minister in 1940. Never elected, the great savior of democracy, did not win an election, nor did his ally Joseph Stalin. But again, no principles for our own side. Kyle Anzalone, any final words?
That article that I said is called The Gaza Bombshell. It's in Vanity Fair from 2008 by David Rose.
And summarize the take again real quick.
I don't know. I don't remember every detail off the top of my head, but it's generally the story of how America reacted to the election of Hamas in Gaza and how it blew up in America's face.
Very interesting. I will check that out. Patrick, anything else you got for us?
That Raico book, I'm sure, is Great Wars and Great Leaders, or a libertarian rebuttal, and that's on Mises for free. So you should read it.
And the chapter, I think, is titled Rethinking Churchill. He makes a lot of good points in there. Thank you to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. Make sure you're subbed on Odyssey. As I was playing the videos of the Israeli police, I go, oh, this is going to get taken down off YouTube or something. But we got to push the envelope. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keith.